Lies of P is a game that takes a lot of inspiration from Sekiro. The most obvious example of this is Fury Attacks, a mechanic that's a copy of Sekiro's Perilous Attacks. But unfortunately, Fury Attacks are a failed copy. They misunderstand why Perilous Attacks exist in the first place. The reason is that in Sekiro, you respond to most attacks by parrying, but Perilous Attacks cannot be parried. You have to respond to them by either jumping, dashing, or something else, just not parrying. The thing is that the parry is a fairly simple mechanic, and it would be boring if you could defeat an enemy by just mindlessly parrying over and over. So Perilous Attacks stop you from parrying and make you adapt in order to add variety to combat. Lies of P takes this concept and turns it into Fury Attacks. Visually, these mechanics are fairly similar, big slow red indicator, but one small difference is that while Perilous Attacks can't be parried, Fury Attacks can only be parried, which is pointless. Fury Attacks force the player into doing the thing that they were already going to do. What is the point of this? Why is this in the game? Well, the reason why is obvious. Lies of P just copies Perilous Attacks without understanding why they exist in the first place. And this is a fantastic example of Lies of P as a whole. This game is a patchwork deluge of poorly ripped off ideas. It only ever copies on a surface level, oblivious to any deeper meaning or purpose. But in the case of Sekiro, it's understandable. This game is weird. It's often considered to be an outcast among its contemporaries, but I think this is a grave understatement. Sekiro isn't just different, its core design philosophy is the complete opposite to every other Soulsborne game. To show what I mean, let's compare Sekiro to its most conventional peer, Elden Ring, which creates deep gameplay in the traditional method, by focusing all of the player's attention onto a single outstanding mechanic, the dodge roll. This is a completely ubiquitous mechanic because it's, well, very fun. Using a dodge roll requires good timing, yeah, but the interesting part is that it presents the player with a lot of choice without you even realizing it. For example, you have the choice between rolling early and rolling late. Rolling late is safer because it makes the timing easier, and rolling early is more difficult, but gives you more time to counter because you get out of the rolling animation while the enemy is still attacking. Or you have the choice between rolling in and rolling out. Rolling towards an enemy keeps you in their range, but it also keeps them in your range, while rolling away gives you the distance needed to heal, but if you're over-reliant on retreating, then you'll get stuck in a corner and die. And I'm just scratching the surface. There's countless little things that all combine to make the dodge roll a very compelling mechanic. The fact that two different players can use it in two completely different ways and both be successful is a blatant sign of depth. Now, Elden Ring doesn't do much work from here, it just takes this inherently deep mechanic and spotlights it. Every boss fight is little more than a glorified excuse in order to get the player to use the dodge roll. Even the poorly designed enemies can be pretty damn fun, because the dodge roll is just that interesting. This method of design, where you place all of the player's attention onto a single outstanding mechanic, is the most traditional way of creating fun gameplay. I like to call it internal depth, because one can explain why an internally deep mechanic is fun without even mentioning the context it exists within. Now, Sekiro takes this idea of internal depth and ignores it, because Sekiro literally does the exact opposite. Sekiro practices external depth. Rather than having a single mechanic that's so outstanding that context becomes irrelevant, Sekiro takes a collection of rather boring mechanics and redeems them with a particularly interesting context. It's kind of like how a bolognese doesn't have one standout ingredient, it's just a bunch of more humble flavors working in synergy. This is how Sekiro operates. Earlier I mentioned how Perilous Attacks cover up a weakness of the parry, but these two ideas also highlight each other's strongest aspects. Parrying is a test of timing and reflex, while Perilous Attacks test enemy familiarity and pattern recognition. These are two completely opposite modes of play, and Sekiro makes you switch between them rapidly, which is really fun. The contrast between the two makes each independently more compelling, and that's just me talking about two of Sekiro's many mechanics. There's other physical inputs like dashing and jumping, but also more abstract concepts like positioning, or being aggressive versus conservative. All of these ideas are pretty basic on their own, but it's the way that Sekiro mixes them together which creates an intricate, thoughtful game. This is external depth, I couldn't explain to you why the parry is interesting without mentioning the context that surrounds it. And of course, I haven't even mentioned the most important part of this context yet: the enemies. These mechanics are kind of a random collection of different ideas. They don't have any inherent relationship with each other. And so the enemies give them a relationship. Without perilous attacks, dashing, jumping, and positioning would not really have any meaning as defensive tools. There's no reason to jump when the option to parry exists, which is why the game takes away your ability to parry. Now you either explore the game's mechanics to their fullest and have a lot of fun, or die. And importantly, perilous attacks are not something you do. They're something that the enemy does to you. The enemies attack you in such a way that they coalesce your disparate toolset into a single coherent experience. Now, not every enemy makes you use every tool. In fact, most enemies only require the use of 2 or 3, which very elegantly creates a vast amount of enemy variety. For example, bosses like Genichiro and Monk test the basics, such as parrying and your ability to switch between parrying and perilousing, but bosses like Ape don't really care about parrying whatsoever, and instead place a much greater importance on your positioning and aggression. A boss like Owl values both parrying skill and positioning, but he can punish you for being too aggressive. And of course, Saint Ishin is the ultimate test of everything you've learned up until this point, demanding a simultaneous mastery of every single tool. At least I assume so. I still never beat Hatred Demon. Every enemy in Sekiro requires the player to use the same basic tools, but they each make you use them in different ways, which makes them all profoundly distinct from one another. They each highlight different parts of the game and activate different parts of your brain, which is genius, a lot of fun, and something that doesn't happen in Lies of P. In fact, the bosses in Lies of P are witheringly repetitive. Yeah, they look different, and they apply different status effects to you, but if you look past the bells and whistles, what you'll notice is that the gameplay is identical for each one. You just mindlessly spam parry over and over. This is because the parry in Lies of P is overpowered. The timing window is extremely generous, and even if you miss time, the game doesn't overly punish you, having you only take about half the damage you otherwise would. Furthermore, if you time your parry correctly, you're rewarded excessively. Perfect timing can deal damage to the enemy, restore lost health, replenish your items, sharpen your blade. Essentially, the parry is too strong. There are other defensive mechanics in Lies of P, but there's little reason to consider using them. The parry is less risky and more rewarding. Naturally, this leads to the player just parrying every attack from every enemy, meaning that there's very little practical distinction between any two enemies. But the thing is, almost everything I just said about Lies of P's parry is also true of Sekiro's parry. In fact, Sekiro's parry is more problematic, since you can just spam the defend button without even having to worry about the timing. But despite this blatantly overpowered mechanic being the core of the entire game, Sekiro doesn't suffer any of the same issues that Lies of P does. This is because Sekiro knows its parry is overpowered and shallow, and so designs the game with those flaws in mind. Sekiro very intentionally uses external depth for the parry, not internal depth, because the parry doesn't have any depth, it's just one button, so it can't withstand the burden of attention. It's not interesting. But Lies of P is oblivious to this. It just slaps the parry into the game and channels all the player's focus towards it. In other words, Lies of P tries to use internal depth with a mechanic designed for external depth. It's like choosing a condiment as the centerpiece of a dish. It fundamentally misunderstands the role of complementary mechanics. This is why I say Lies of P tries to copy and fails. It successfully mimics the parry itself. In fact, Lies of P's parry is better than Sekiro's, but it fails to understand the context that Sekiro's parry exists within. But the thing is, Lies of P has much bigger flaws than anything I've discussed in this video. But the fact that it copies so soullessly is the reason I don't like it. What I'm looking for in a game, and in any art, is a sincerity that's difficult to describe. What I want is to have a conversation with the creator. I want to listen to them speak. But Lies of P has nothing to say. This game is pretty clearly not sincere. It doesn't copy Sekiro out of love or respect, it just copies Sekiro because Sekiro made a lot of money. Thus, I cannot relate to Lies of P. I have no respect for it, and no sympathy for its numerous flaws. I find the experience as a whole to be very corporate and banal. And I just think that that's kind of a shame. But anyway, thank you for watching this video. I am kind of trying to turn YouTube into a source of income for myself, because I don't have any income. So if you'd like to help out by subscribing, that would help me out so much.